April 9, 1945, Norwegian Sea. Night rides the gale like a black horse. Wind combs the tops off waves and flings them as cold knives across steel. A U.S. destroyer cuts north under blackout. Only a thin red glow on the bridge plotting table to prove the ship is alive. The sea smells of oil and iron. Every swell lifts the bow to a sky without stars, then drops it into a valley where the world disappears. Contact to starboard, the lookout murmurs, voice frayed by salt. The XO lifts binoculars. A grubby shape heaves in and out of sight. Wood hull, stubby mast, net streaming like seaweed from a wound. A German trawler, engine coughing, stern pinned by a snarl of gear that drags her sideways toward the mine line, charted in pencil and fear. On the bridge of USS Halcyon, Captain Daniel Hale listens to the sea and the silence of his crew. One order will end this. One slate-gray broadside, one quick flare of fire, one less risk to the convoy astern. The other order will be harder. It will be wet work, slow work, dangerous work for men who are already tired. He breathes once. Then he says, "Bring up searchlights. Signal. Prepare to receive tow." The storm answers first. By April 1945, the Norwegian Sea had become a ledger of risks written in grease pencil. The Arctic convoys had done their brutal work for years. Murky files of HX, JW, and RA sailings crawling along the top of the world while submarines counted torpedoes and Stukas counted daylight. Now, at the war's ragged end, the sea was still mined with yesterday's anger. The Luftwaffe's reach had shortened. U-boats hugged the coast like guilty shadows. But the water kept its old habits. Cold, treacherous, indifferent. The U.S. destroyer Halcyon, DD 628, was not meant to be a hero. She was a steel equation. 34 knots on clean screws, 5 5-inch guns, K-guns and stern racks for pattern drops, a pair of paravanes, and sonar that could hear a frog cough if the sea behaved. Her orders were plain as boilerplate. Screen a homebound convoy that had bled its way past the North Cape. Keep depth charges at the ready. Keep the wolves hungry and the merchants unmolested. Good orders. Clean orders. Orders that didn't mention fishermen. The chart table on Halcyon showed a coast carved into teeth. Skerries, reefs, and narrow leads. Pencil hatches marked M for minefields. Some placements were official. Allied belts seeded to deny U-boats channels. Others were German and guessed at, laid in haste as the Reich retreated, unrecorded except by rumor and the occasional thunder under a gull's cry. The helmsman glanced at those hatches the way a man looks at a loaded revolver. No bravado there, just respect. Rules of engagement sat in a green binder near the captain's chair, the pages furred with salt and oil from a dozen refits. They were legal sentences that tried to hold back weather and fear. Aid to enemy survivors is authorized when tactical situation permits. Do not endanger convoy integrity. Avoid coastlines likely to be mined unless escort commander approves. The binder didn't know about a trawler whose nets had snagged a wreck and made a noose of rope and wire. It didn't know about diesel coughing and dying pulses or a mast lamp that tried to be brave and only managed to be dim. Captain Daniel Hale knew his ship the way a physician knows a chronic patient. He had learned her moods, the way the bow would thud after a quartering sea, the way the gyro sang when the rudder worked too hard, the way the engine room wrote its fatigue and steam smells and the pitch of bearings. He was not sentimental, but he had a superstition about the bell and touched it entering the bridge during weather. Not for luck, but to remind himself that a ship is a promise made of rivets. You keep your end. She keeps hers. That night, the convoy lay astern in a string of dim hulks, screened by 2 other destroyers and a corvette with paint scabbed by years of salt. The radio was a mutter of call signs and position checks. The ocean returned, each sound doubled and smeared. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Norwegian pilots tended lighthouses that had learned to whisper light instead of shout it. Somewhere upfjord, a U-boat might be riding out the gale, nose tucked into mud, hull shivering each time the sea struck the surface hard enough to send pressure waves down like fists. The trawler wasn't on any plot. She appeared in the false day of searchlight like a confession. Wood hull, blunt bow, gillnet drum steel-banded by years. Her stern was a tangle of mesh and cable that dragged like a sea anchor, pulling her sideways toward the blotted smudge of a penciled M on the chart. The line of mines the Allies had sown to keep U-boats out of a narrows used by coasters. The irony made no difference to the sea. A mine does not ask about uniforms. Across the bridge, the executive officer, Lieutenant Aaron Coyle, adjusted his cap and cleared his throat. "Convoy commander won't love us lingering," he offered. "The Navy's way of saying, sir, the clean order is to keep moving." Hale nodded. "No one loves lingering in a minefield." "Enemy flagged," Coyle said, softer. "Could be a decoy. Could be dinner for us all if she drags one of those cans to us," the sonar chief muttered, eyes never leaving the scope. The chaplain arrived uninvited, as chaplains do when decisions begin to smell of blood. He said nothing, only stood with hands clasped behind him and watched the gray shape heave in and out of the searchlight's reach. A destroyer carries many specialists: gunners who can solve trigonometry with their fingers, quartermasters who can thread a needle in a gale, electricians who speak voltage. The chaplain's trade is silence. Signals flashed across the water. "Stand by to receive tow." "Heave to, we will pass line." Halcyon bled speed. Her bow rose, fell, and sent spray like shrapnel across the forecastle, where men clipped in and leaned out with boat hooks. They were not rescuing enemies, not exactly. They were rescuing facts: a hull in distress, a mine belt ahead, a convoy that did not need ghosts on its conscience. Sailors know another law beyond binders and orders. It's older than flags. It says that a small boat in trouble is you in other clothes. When the line arced through the air, tarred hemp gone dark with rain, the trawler's deckhands hesitated as if they'd been offered a weapon or forgiveness and couldn't tell which. Then a gaunt man in a salt-crusted cap, Skipper Brandt, though Halcyon didn't know his name yet, bellowed a wordless command, and hands flew. The tow bit. The destroyer took the strain, her stern digging, her screws pulling a shape heavy with nets and fear. The convoy slid farther astern, obedient to orders written miles away. The sea around Halcyon narrowed to a working circle, towline paravanes humming, sonar clicking, searchlight carving rain into glass needles. In the lee of the bridge, Coyle leaned in again. "Sir, if we do this, we're dancing along that mine line. We'll be a stationary target in spirit, if not in fact." Hale didn't answer right away. He looked down at the chart, then at the green binder, then at the trawler bucking like a tired horse. He could feel his crew waiting for a tone in his voice, a certain kind of calm that meant the decision had already been made inside him. "Signal the convoy," he said at last. "We're detaching for humanitarian assist. Recommend Corvette Red Start close up our station. We'll rejoin at dawn if the sea allows." The radio man hesitated half a heartbeat, then keyed the set. The sea answered with static. Somewhere in that tangle, a human voice would say yes or no. Halcyon didn't wait. The towline had spoken first. The mine line on the chart looked fat and certain. Out there, it was rumor in black water. To port, skerries. To starboard, deep rods of gray that fell into nothing. The only way out was a thread pulled through a needle, while the ship and the storm argued about who owned the hand. And on the trawler's deck, men stared aft at the destroyer with faces that said they'd expected shellfire and gotten a line instead. Expectation has momentum. Mercy has drag. The two met in that line, and everything else would have to follow it. Wind wears down certainties faster than war does. On the German trawler Seestern, certainty had been gone for months. She was a wooden workhorse out of Bodu, 48 feet stem to stern, with a stubborn diesel that preferred prayer to fuel and a winch that had taught 3 generations the rhythm of poverty and pride. Her paint had learned every winter in the Vestfjorden. Her crew had learned to count the steps from wheelhouse to net drum in the dark. War had taken sons to the front, husbands to factories, and fish to deeper, colder places. What it had given back were ration cards and new rules shouted by men in uniforms that changed color with the year. Skipper Johann Brandt was not a political man. He was a man of weather, of smell and sound. He could tell you what the wind had done to the sea 3 miles ahead by how it tasted on his tongue. He could trim a net by ear. He could also tell you, without knowing exactly why, that April had shifted into a temper older than nations. The gale had a hook in it. The swell ran counter to its own logic, and his nets, once lowered, had bitten into something that wasn't fish and refused to let go. At first it felt like the usual stubbornness: rock, wreckage, an old anchor. Then the winch screamed high and thin, the frame bucked, and Seestern yawed hard to port. The engine coughed and fell into a death rattle. The stern settled, dragged by a snarl of mesh and cable that swallowed water like a drowning mouth. The compass card wavered. The boat stopped being a boat and became a plank balanced over a rumor of mines. Everyone had heard about the mine corridors. Some lines were German, laid to keep the Allies off the coast. Others were Allied, laid to trap U-boats that used the skerries as hedgehog holes. Nobody marked them for fishermen. Minds drift. They forget their charts. They rise like wicked buoys after storms and then duck under again. The sea does not keep books well when angry. Brandt's crew was a catalogue of what war leaves behind. Ansel, 19, whose father had not returned from Narvik. Ilse's brother Mathis, who had frozen his left hand on a winter trip, and now handled rope with 3 stubborn fingers and 2 that remembered pain. Hannes, the radio man who carried a crumpled photograph in his shirt pocket and a prayer he never finished. They knew how to move when the deck tilted and how to keep silence when fear needed room. They also knew what capture meant. Stories flew faster than seabirds of trawlers shelled by accident, of men made to jump and then rescued too late. Revenge is cheaper at sea. There are no witnesses except gulls. When Seestern's mast lamp sputtered into life and rain made its own static against the glass, the shape that came out of the night behind the storm looked like a verdict. Length of a destroyer, bow shouldered with waves, searchlight ready to pour daylight onto guilt. Brandt barked orders anyway, because orders hold back panic. Cut what you can. Shift weight forward. Keep the stern up. Pray the engine gives you a cough more than a sigh. The deckhands hacked at the net with knives too small for the job. The mesh clung like wire-laced seaweed. Once, twice, the winch tried to free itself and only groaned like an old animal. The bilge pumps took up their litany. The wind slapped the rigging into a spray of angry beads. Hannes lifted his headphones and found only the ocean's teeth. The set was a museum piece, tubes dreaming of warmth. He tried anyway, tapping a distress into the night that knew more about iron than Morse. Somewhere in the noise he thought he heard a human voice, and then lost it. Lightning showed the coast as a black claw. The mine corridor was supposed to run east of the skerries, but supposed is a word that doesn't keep men alive. The first American signal, unreadable through rain, illegible through disbelief, flashed like an accusation. Then the second, prepare to receive Tau. Ansel laughed once, that single sound a man makes when fatalism trips over grace. Brandt didn't laugh. He swore, then crossed himself, then swore again. Lines ready. Don't stare, move. A tow from a destroyer is not a gentle suggestion. It is a promise of violence shared. If the tow takes wrong, a trawler can be pulled stern first into a swell, rolled under like a seal in a shark's mouth. If it takes right, a small grace becomes a large one. The line came like a thrown question, heavy, certain, indifferent to flags. It hit the deck with the thud of wet rope and decision. On Halcyon, the scene had its own grammar. Paravanes streamed to cut any strays. Depth charge safeties were dogged down. No one wanted their own stern to become a wreck. Men clipped their harnesses and learned the trawler's silhouette by heart, because when work gets dangerous, you marry your eyes to a single shape and refuse to look away. The first strain took Seestern's breath. She lurched, hesitated, then followed like a stubborn animal taught one more trick than it wanted to learn. The snarled nets pulled like a second boat. Somewhere beneath, metal scraped metal. The sound of mesh brushing a wreck or a mine tether. Everyone pretended they hadn't heard it. Pretending is a seamanship skill in storms. From the trawler's wheelhouse, Brandt saw the destroyer's bridge lit red as a wound. He pictured officers with clean collars and maps that didn't run or smear. He told himself they were calculating risk to their convoy, not mercy to fishermen. It's easier to accept help if you pretend it isn't kindness. But on Halcyon's bridge, the calculation was already personal. The chaplain stood behind Captain Hale like a shadow with ears. The XO angled his lips near the captain's shoulder and murmured about fuel curves, tow strain, convoy schedule. Hale nodded once and kept his eyes on the towline's catenary, on the needle tick of the sounder, on the faint, treacherous lift in the swell that meant shoaling water near the skerries. The chart said mines. The wind said hurry. The tow said patience. He chose all three and let the ship argue with itself in steel. Back on Seestern, fear settled into work, the best end it can hope for. Ansel cut a last loop of mesh free from a cleat and watched it slither away, part of a livelihood chosen to live later rather than die now. Mathis braced his ruined hand on the drum and grinned at nothing. Hannes looked at his photograph and slid it back into his pocket as if it might keep the boat's heart warm. When the towline came tight and the American searchlight moved off their eyes to paint water ahead, the deck felt less like a trap and more like a road. It still rose and fell, still hunted for new ways to betray balance, but the motion had purpose. Purpose is a cure for many sicknesses. Behind them, black water closed. Before them, the thin thread of a lead that locals knew and charts pretended to. Beyond that, a harbor that had learned to keep its lamps hooded and its welcome short. Between all of it, the towline, one rope braided of 3. Risk, rules, and a choice that might have been called treason by men who had never been to sea in a storm. The storm kept its counsel. The sea kept its old grudges. The 2 boats kept to their work until the next questions arrived. How to hold a tow through a mine corridor. How to spare a convoy and still save strangers. How to decide what a net is worth when weighed against time and lives. Those answers lived in angles. Human, technical, moral, that would now tighten like knots. On the bridge of Halcyon, Captain Daniel Hale looked older than his file. Salt carves men into what they already are. In him it revealed a patient severity, the habit of listening to instruments until they confessed their mood, the discipline of saying less than he knew. He had been a destroyer officer long enough to learn that speeches corrode in spray. Orders should be short. Regrets belong in private. He felt the toe through his boots. Not metaphor, physics. A shudder that traveled the length of the ship, up into the stanchions, across the deck to the bridge combing where his gloved hand rested. A trawler's weight, its snagged gear, its fear, all transposed into a hum in steel. "Steady on," he said. The helmsman kept the compass card nailed to its mark as if faith were a muscle. Across the towline, Skipper Johann Brandt planted his boots wide in a wheelhouse that leaked in 3 places and smelled of rope, wet wood, and diesel. The wheel fought him like an old horse that remembered a different rider. He did not let it win. He watched the destroyer's stern lights and learned the American's language in a minute. A slight dip, slacken. A clean, even pull follow. A sudden surge, brace. A man can learn a great deal from another ship's posture. It is body talk on a scale of tons. The 2 men spoke to each other without words, separated by storm and law and a war's arithmetic. Hale eased his engines when the swell tried to wrench the tow out of the sea. Brandt dumped what he could of the fouled net to keep the stern from squatting. In another year, in any other world, both men would have been content to argue about weather in a harbor bar and pretend it was science. Tonight they argued with motion and kept each other alive. Hale thought not of headlines but of his crew's hands. He pictured the stokers in the hot black world below, feeding boilers that asked for more like greedy saints. The boatswain on the forecastle, face flayed by spray, kissing the line, with his eyes for signs of galling. The sonar chief wrist tender from hours at the scope, listening for a submarine that might be listening for them. "If I cut this tow," Hale told himself, "we are clean and cruel. If I keep it, we are slower, louder, more beautiful, more at risk." Brandt lived in a simpler math. His crew's faces were coins he had already spent. Ansel's quick grin. Mathis's mangled hand pressed into rope like a confession. Hannes with the photograph. "Hold," he told them, when the boat lunged. Hold, when the tow threatened to pull them backward. Hold, when fear tried to run downhill into shouting. He was not brave so much as stubborn. The sea respects stubborn men. It does not forgive them, but it nods when they pass. Between them, mercy took the shape of a taut line and 2 men refusing panic. That is what history will not write. How often survival is a duet. Towing in a gale is a technical prayer. You construct. It imparts catenary curve, scope, lead, relative motion, shock load. You recite it with engines instead of breath. The towline on Halcyon was a hawser that remembered other rescues, its fibers saturated with old brine and new intent. The boatswain paid out just enough to keep a belly in the line, catenary to, absorb the sea's punches, then took a half-turn on the bit so the ship could feel the trawler's mood. Paravanes streamed outboard, armored fish on wire, their vane plates biting water to shear aside anything that floated with a metal heart and bad manners. They hummed through the hull like distant bees. The depth charge safeties were dogged. Pistols removed. A single loose lever, a single slap of green water across the stern, and charity would become obituary. The trawler's gear complicated everything. Nets hold water. In that sense, they become liquid weight. Dead, implacable. The fouled bundle dragged astern like a second hull. When the swell lifted Seestern, the net rose a moment later, tugging the stern down with vengeful delay. When Halcyon pulled, the net answered with a lag that doubled strain. It is the physics of sympathy, ugly and exact. Hale kept one eye on the engine order telegraph and another on the inclinometer, two instruments that tell a captain how much faith he may borrow from the next wave. He ordered small changes, never big ones. Big orders snap lines, small ones bend fate. Ahead 2/3, he said. Then, when the towline's belly flattened, ahead 1/2. The ship responded like a well-trained animal, ears flicking, shoulders shifting, weight finding its balance. Below decks, the chief engineer adjusted feed water as if seasoning soup. Too much and steam collapsed into wetness, too little, and the boilers ran hot and hungry. Bearings were checked with fingertips, tender, knowledgeable touches that read temperature the way a nurse reads fever. Men talk bravado topside. Down here, awe is the safer tone. On Seestern, the winch became a bargaining table. Brandt ordered the drum to pick up slack in the fouled net in slow pulses whenever Halcyon gave him a breath, then to ease, then to pick, up again, a rhythm that kept the tangle from becoming a hard, murderous anchor. Mathis fed the drum with bad fingers and good judgment. Ansel crawled aft on his stomach to knock ice off a roller with the back of a knife. Every small act tamped down a future catastrophe. The searchlight scratched a white tunnel through rain. The sounder ticked like a metronome of dread. 30 fathoms, 28, 30 again as the ship found a line in the contour that wasn't on any chart. The signalman, God bless him, kept sending short bursts toward the trawler in lamp code. Steady. Follow stern. When we rise, you rise. Physics becomes a language if you let it. When a black shape rolled in a trough to port, round, studded, obscene as a medieval weapon, every man who saw it forgot how to swallow. The paravane wire sang once, high and sweet. The shape vanished into the dark as if embarrassed at its near appearance. No one exhaled until the hum settled back into its work song. Technology that night was not gadgets. It was judgment applied to metal. Orders exist to save you from your better nature. Hale knew that. The XO Lieutenant Coyle embodied it. He was a good officer, good in the way that makes ships come home. He counted fuel. He minded station. He kept the convoy's geometry straight even when the sea tried to bend it into nonsense. "Sir," he said softly, the tone of a man who has chosen the right argument because he refuses to pick the comforting one. "We are obligated to our charges. We are not obligated to every line of work left adrift by a collapsing Reich." Hale let the words stand in the air. Then he let another sentence stand beside them. "We are also obligated to the sea's law, which is, do not let people die when you can prevent it." Coyle spread his hands, palms up. The gesture that says, I know, but also, he pointed toward the green binder, the rules of engagement, and to the wavering smear of the convoy's wake on the radar. "We can be court-martialed for the right reason, sir," he said. It wasn't threat. It was loyalty of a purer sort. Loyalty to the ship's continued usefulness. The chaplain, Lieutenant Aidan Brooke, broke his silence with a question. "XO, if she hits a mine while we steam by, how long will her crew live?" Coyle hated when arguments skipped steps. "Minutes," he said. "Less. Can they row?" "Not with fouled nets. Not in this." The chaplain nodded as if he were writing a sermon he hoped never to preach. "Then our prudence has a body count. Leadership in a gale is the art of choosing which fear to obey." Hale gathered his officers with his eyes and gave them the tone they waited for, the one that said the decision had settled in him. "Signal the convoy again. Red Start will fill our slot. We will conduct humanitarian tow along the inshore lead. Engines answer small. Helm answers smooth. If the sea coughs up danger, we'll hear it first." He paused, then added what only leaders can add without breaking a crew's back. "Good work is holy. Do it well." Coyle did not smile, but his shoulders changed shape. He became execution instead of argument. "Aye," he said, and became the clean edge of a difficult choice. The chaplain breathed as if he had been underwater and now remembered air. He stayed on the bridge, not to bless, but to notice, because Men behave better when someone is watching with compassion instead of curiosity. Down on the forecastle, the boatswain told his gang what mattered. Captain's got the tow, that means you have the strain, no heroics. Heroes die at the same speed as fools. They grinned. That was the Navy they recognized. Courage trimmed to fit the job. Leadership is not a speech shouted into wind. It is ballast placed where a ship would otherwise hobby horse itself to death. That ballast tonight was a choice to be slower, louder, riskier, for strangers whose names would never make the muster book. And because that ballast held, the next set of decisions, enemy fear, tactical threading through mines, a harbor's waiting lamps, could exist at all. Fear changes tempo with weather. On Seestern, it took the form of fingers too stiff for knots and eyes too wide for night. Ansel kept swallowing salt and calling it courage. He had learned boat work by copying uncles, not by wanting it. War had drafted him into the sea as surely as it drafted others into trenches. He watched the destroyer's stern lamps, too pale, coins spending themselves on the rain, and told himself the Americans were rescuing a problem, not people. That made it easier to stand upright. Hannes wore his headphones like pennants. The radio was mostly static and ghosts, but he listened the way a man listens for a heartbeat through a wall. Between crashes of interference, he thought he heard a convoy's murmur, a scatter of call signs like birds too far to identify. In his pocket, the photograph, creased a dozen times, pressed against his ribs. A woman, a small boy in a cap, both looking somewhere just to the left of the lens, as if the future were standing off frame and would not come closer. Mattis worked, the drum with his good fingers and the stubborn ones, face set in that grimace of senseless amusement men wear when pain is an old roommate. The net moaned on the roller. It was their work made monstrous, familiar mesh, now heavy with water and scrap and a memory of some wreck's iron bones. He hated it for that betrayal, and loved it because it paid for bread. Not today, he told it, and the words fogged the air. Skipper Johann Brandt kept the wheel in his voice. He said the same words in a dozen tones: hold, easy, now, good. And by changing tone, he changed meaning. He allowed no pleading in his voice because pleading is contagious. When the searchlight swept forward to show them the gray and black grammar of sea and scary, he held his breath like everyone else. When it swung aft and left them in honest dark, he remembered how to blink. What they expected from the destroyer was order delivered as violence. What they received was order delivered as patience. It unsettled them more than a shot would have. It asked a question they weren't ready to answer. If your enemy does not behave like your story, what else in the story is wrong? Brandt tucked the question away. He had a boat to keep level. When a mine's round shadow bloomed and vanished to port, Ansel whispered the Lord's Prayer out of sequence and then started over. Not because he believed the words would stop iron, but because they gave his brain something to do that wasn't screaming. Hannes kept one ear on the sea and one ear on hope. Mattis leaned into the drum. Their fear slowed into work again, which is the best rhythm men have at sea. The lead they chose was a rumor with coordinates. Old fishermen knew it. Charts hinted at it. War had made it hazardous with lines of anger sunk just below memory. Halcyon's bridge ran the math like a catechism. Quartermaster with a hand-bearing compass, calling bearings off the skerries when the searchlight painted them pale. The signalman flashing clipped instructions aft. The helmsman making corrections small enough to be forgiven by momentum. Sounder? Hale asked. 30 fathoms, 28, 32. Coyle replied, voice flat, as if tone could keep the numbers from becoming a slope toward steel. Paravanes? Humming steady. Tow strain? Within limits, sir. She complains, but she follows. The gale shoved cross at the worst place, where the lead narrowed and the mine corridor was supposed to begin. The sea taught the destroyer humility by setting her on her ear twice, just enough to rattle men and instruments. Hale bled a hair of speed, then paid it back when the towline's catenary began to flatten. The ship and captain traded inches and favors like old friends in a crowded bar. Coyle worried the convoy like a rosary. If a U-boat rode the outer edge of the weather, it could listen to this drama in the screw's pitch and track it like a bloodhound. If a mine had parted its mooring and wandered, the sea's version of a drunk with a gun, it might be loitering right where prudence and mercy intersected. He didn't say any of this aloud. He just kept the green binder open to the page that mattered and held a pencil poised over the log. "Sir." "Scary ahead, fine to starboard." "Bearing 045, the quartermaster called. "Mark." "Marked." "Shift searchlight 10 degrees port." "Show me that left shoulder," Hale ordered. The beam raked water that had never wanted light on it and found a band of smoother chop, lee water off a reef. "There." He pointed with 2 fingers, the Navy way. "We ride that lee. A good tow feels like a conversation. You do not interrupt. You suggest—" Halcyon suggested a new angle. Seestern accepted. The line went from angry to firm. The net's heavy drag shifted with the swell and played nice for 3 breaths in a row. Luxury. Then the weather reinvented itself. A downsquall erased the world. Rain became a curtain of iron filings. The searchlight made a white wall 2 ship lengths out and no further. Sonar doubled to static. The destroyer and trawler were alone in a circle of blindness with a minefield just beyond imagination's arm. Here, seamanship is faith with math attached. "Helm, keep 032 true by gyro," Hale said. 032I. "Engine room, ahead 1/2. Stand by for backing bell on my mark." "Ahead 1/2, standing by." "Tow party, watch that belly. You see it snap, you sing out, 'Aye.'" They passed through the squall like a seam ripped and resewn. On the far side, the sounder ticked 30 fathoms again. Men laughed without making a sound, mouths open, heads falling forward. The signalman flashed a single letter aft. G. Good a harbor is a promise made of other people's vigilance. Bodo had learned to keep that promise under occupation, then liberation, then the uneasy hush of a war's last weeks. The lighthouse had one pane unpainted, the offer of a line when lives depended and the risk could be explained to a forgiving God. In the town, women kept blankets near stoves in case a boat came in wrong. Men slept in boots when the barometer fell. The sea taught these habits long before flags contested the horizon. That night, the pilot station read the sky and made 2 choices. Keep the outer mark dark, keep the inner lamps ready. A boy with a bicycle waited on the quay with a hand lantern and a look that said he was part of something big and would never forget it. In a window, an old fisherman lifted his own lamp and set it low, the way his father had done in winters when the cod run turned into a survival lesson. News travels strange paths over water. By the time Halcyon's searchlight brushed the outer skerries, the harbor knew enough of the story to imagine the rest. An American destroyer with an enemy trawler in tow. A mine line sulking in the dark, weather that had opinions. In the readiness room of the small clinic, a nurse laid out bandages and poured hot water into a basin, not because she expected blood, but because hope is easier with steam. On board Seestern, Ansel saw the glow of a town under blackout, the muted geometry of lives continuing, and felt his knees go weak. Mathis let go of the drum for the first time in hours and flexed his fingers until the pain sang. Hannes tapped the photograph twice as if the boy in the cap would understand the signal. On Halcyon, the crew found themselves caring about strangers' nets. It surprised them. War trains you to subtract. The sea trains you to add. Here they were, towing not only men but their livelihood. Mesh and corks and weights that meant meals and marriages. The boatswain, who had never been sentimental in his life, tapped the line with affection the way a man pats a good horse. Community that night was not nationality. It was a chain of small reliabilities. A pilot boat warming engines, a lighthouse holding its wink for the right moment, a destroyer captain trimming speed to keep someone else's future intact, a trawler skipper choosing not to cut away the work that fed his people even when time hissed at him to do it. By the time the inner lamps kindled, low, hooded perfect, both ships were committed to a channel just wider than their combined stubbornness. The wind still pressed its argument against the rigging. The mines still sulked out there like forgotten sins. But the harbor had extended its hands and the towline felt lighter in men's minds. Ahead waited the part of the story that would be remembered. The snap of a line, the bright swing of a mine, the final choice between speed and mercy. Behind waited the convoy, humming its long, indifferent song. Between the two, a narrow path of water and will. The lead narrowed to the width of a decision. To port, the skerries rose like knuckles bruised by centuries. To starboard, deep water that rumor said was laced with cans. The round, studded kind that don't forgive mistakes. Overhead, the gale still argued its old case. Underfoot, the towline hummed a counter-argument in hemp. Tow strain? Captain Hale asked, voice level. High holding, the boatswain sang back. She's heavy with that cursed skirt, feels like we're dragging two hulls. Sounder. 3-1 fathoms, steady. Pair of vanes. Humming sweet. If there's anything outboard, they'll flirt first. Hale stood easy because he had trained easy into a habit. The XO coil read the chart and the sea at once. A pencil tip hovering over a penciled corridor that might have been a safe lane or a suggestion. The chaplain stood silent and stubborn, hands knit behind his back like a man who refused to clap at the wrong time. A squall tore across them, short and mean. The searchlight turned the rain into white bars. In the wash, something rolled. Round black, a medieval morning star dragged forward by a sulky chain. Paravane wire sang high and bright. Men flinched without stepping. The shape slid back into night like an apology no one believed. Mark that, Hale said softly. We're inside their orchard. On Seestern, Brandt felt the mine without seeing it. Boats telegraph the nearness of wrong things through the soles of your feet. He eased the wheel a hair, not enough to tug the towline into anger, just enough to give fate a shoulder to lean on if it wanted mercy. Easy, he told the drum. Easy, he told Mattis. Easy, he told himself. The sea changed pitch. That was the only warning. The interval between swells shortened by a quarter second. The wind veered a breath to the north. The sounder ticked 30, 29, 32 in a hiccup of bathymetry. The towline's catenary flattened, belly gone tight as a bowstring. Engines ahead 1/3, Hale ordered. No gallops. We walk. Ahead 1/3, aye. Helm. Keep 028 true. 028. Aye. The next event arrived with the casual cruelty of the sea. A cross sea hit the trawler's quarter. Tried to square her to the swell, and the fouled net answered like a brake set at the wrong time. Seestern slewed, stern dropping into a trough, bow hunting, towline jerking from song to snarl. The hawser leaped on Halcyon's bits and shrieked. Every man on the forecastle heard fibers tear themselves into shorter lives. Slack. Slack, the boatswain bellowed. She's at the breaking note. Engines, back 1/4, 2 seconds, now ahead 1/3, Hale snapped. The helmsman rode the wheel like a violin, fine motions only, keeping the destroyer from yawing her own tow into ruin. Below, the chief rolled steam off just enough to soften the shock. The towline lived, but it raised a price. A second thinner line, one of the safety whips that kept the main hawser tamed, snapped and whiplashed across the forecastle. It missed a seaman's face by the width of a prayer, and carved a groove in the rail instead. He laughed the laugh sailors save for when they prefer not to cry and kissed the rail with his glove. Skipper, Mathis shouted from Seestern's stern. Net's got new teeth. Brandt saw it. The fouled mass had coughed up a prize. Twisted metal, ribs of a dead boat snagged in their mesh, maybe part of a mine's old mooring gear. It swung like an anchor on the wrong end of a story. He had seconds to choose between his winter's wages and his crew's breath. He chose like a man who had rehearsed loss. Cut it, he said. Cut it clean. Mattis's bad hand failed. His good hand succeeded. The scrap slid away, hungry to take someone with it. The swell chose otherwise. Weight bled off, not much, but enough for the trawler to lift an inch more eagerly. Brandt did not bless it. He kept his hands where the wheel could see them. Captain, Coyle said, eyes still on the chart. We can shoot the gap if we push. One burst of speed, we clear the worst of the charted line. Risks are front-loaded, but we spend less time near badness. Hale watched the towline, not the chart. We push, we snatch the hawser. We snatch the hawser, we turn Charity into wreckage. Then we loiter in a minefield, sir. We proceed, Hale said, and the word had weight. No loiter, no rush. We proceed. The wind made its own case with a gust that tried to lift the searchlight out of its brackets. The beam jittered. In that jitter, a new shape appeared ahead. A buoy without paint. A mooring with its top bitten off, chain taut to something sullen below. Not a mine, a hitching point abandoned by men in a hurry. We take that, Hale said, a decision arriving fully formed. We re-rig the tow and shorten scope. Get us a cleaner lead. Coyle stared at him. Sir, that's the mine line's backyard. Exactly, Hale replied. No one else plays there tonight. The boatswain had a launch swung out already for contingency he hadn't wanted to name. Sir, in this sea, Hale said. XO, you have the con. Boats, pick your best 3. Chaplain. Stay off that boat unless God promotes you to boatswain in the next 10 seconds. The whaler hit water with a slap that sounded personal. 3 men in a coil of smaller line bucked toward the unpainted mooring like drunks determined to walk a straight line. The searchlight steadied for them. The sea did not. Twice the bow rose like a hand asking to be called on. Twice it fell into a slam that bit teeth. They reached the mooring on the third try and made a show of sobriety that fooled no one. Boat hook out. Loop over. Hands moving with that quick ceremonial competence sailors perform when fear sits in the bleachers. Made fast, the bowman shouted. The word came home in light more than sound. Pay in, the boatswain screamed from Halcyon's forecastle. The big hawser snaked. The catenary changed its lazy belly to a disciplined curve, and the towline's angle cleaned itself by a blessed degree. The ship and trawler stopped arguing for one long, luxurious breath and remembered how to cooperate. The whaler turned to return, and fate turned with it. A black globe, smaller than the earlier one, surfaced on the whaler's quarter. No chain visible, just a dimpled crown and the implacable meaning of steel. The bowman said a word no liturgy owns. The coxswain shoved the tiller. The mine swung past an oar by inches, kissed the sea with a hiss and dipped out of sight like a denied sin. Back aboard, men pretended not to be new people. Strain? Hale asked, as if the whaler had been a rehearsal, not a gamble. Within limits, sir. Better than before. She's behaving. Good, helm. Bring us 2 points starboard. Let the mooring earn its keep. Engines, hold her there. We'll make the inner marks before the next squall if we're polite. On Seestern, Ansel saw something he had never expected to see in the same frame. An American destroyer, a Norwegian mooring, a German trawler, and the idea that tomorrow might exist. He elbowed Hannes and didn't apologize for it. Hannes smiled like a man who, for 1 second, believed a photograph could be a promise instead of a memory. The channel tightened again, because stories like this do not reward early relief. The outer skerries fell astern. The inner lights, hooded modest, peaked once, then went shy behind rain. Halcyon held the line like a surgeon holds a suture. Seestern followed like a patient who had decided finally to live. Ahead waited the last, narrowest bend, where the choice between cutting the nets for speed or keeping them for dignity would become the fulcrum of the night. The last bend hoarded consequence. Inside the skerries, the wind dropped a register, but the swell still shouldered through the gaps with the temper of a thing denied. The inner lamps, hooded, dutiful, licked the rain with small tongues of gold. On Halcyon's bridge, everything narrowed to 3 gauges and 1 rope: sounder, telegraph, inclinometer, towline. Harbor pilot boat showing to port, the signalman announced. A low, clinker-built shape hovered at the edge of the light, a shadow with a white cap of spray and a hand lantern bobbing like a heartbeat. It did not dare come closer. Mines have long arms. Captain Hale lifted the binoculars. The pilot drew his hand across his throat, shallow inside. Keep outside, Mark, slow. Hale answered with a flat palm steady and a 2-finger turn starboard drift to counterset. The pilot nodded as if language were wind and theirs matched for a moment. Tow strain? Borderline good. Sounder? 3-2 fathoms. 3-2-8. Engines ahead 1/4. No surprises. On Seestern, Skipper Brandt read the harbor's breath from the way the lamps trembled. He felt the tow's persuasion in his forearms, the boat's grudges in his knees. Mathis kept the drum alive, easing when Halcyon dipped, snubbing when the trawler tried to outrun her own fear. Hannes checked the radio out of habit and found only rain. Ansel grinned at nothing. Boys do that when they think they've cheated something old. Then the harbor added its test. A back eddy tucked under the lee of a rock reached out and twisted the trawler's stern a finger's width. The fouled net, heavy as a history, caught the turn and magnified it. Seestern yawed 1 point, then 2, her stern trying to cut inside the destroyer's wake. Towline belly flattening to blade. Snatch building. The boatswain roared. She'll part if we hurry, she'll drown if we stop. There are choices that are really verdicts. Skipper, Mathis shouted. If we ditch the rest of the gear, she'll mind the helm. We'll make the bend. We can buy new nets next year. Next year is made of nets, Brandt snapped, then heard himself in the thinness of pride inside the words. He looked at his men, Ansel's boyish hunger, Hannes's photographed darkness, Mathis's mangled hand, then at the destroyer whose men leaned into danger they did not own. He put the wheel steady and said to no one, "A man does not keep tools by spending lives." He grabbed the hatchet himself. 1 swing, 2, 3. Old wood, soaked cork, rope that had learned salt too well to surrender with grace. The last bond parted like a shout bitten in half. The trawler shivered, lighter by a winter's wages. The towline's voice dropped from shriek to song. On Halcyon, Hale had not waited for the decision. He heard it in the tow's change of tone and paid back his ship's patience with a breath of power, just when it could be accepted. "Ahead 1/3, he said. "Hold her. Helm, bring us up a half point. Let the set work for us, not against. Ahead 1/3. Half point right." "Aye." The channel pinched to a place that felt personal. The outer mark slid down the starboard beam. The inner lamp winked low. The pilot boat paralleled them, smart as a herding dog. Coyle kept his pencil on the log and his eyes on the sounder. The chaplain whispered nothing and everything. A jolt, sharp, precise as a tap on a shoulder. Every nerve in every man went to the point of contact and waited for pain that could be measured in tons. The paravein wire thrummed so high it left hearing and entered the bones. A small mine, moored too shallow, had kissed steel. The vein cut through chain or tether with a curt surgical certainty. The hull hummed a complaint. The sea held its breath. The mine rolled astern, angry and impotent. Paravanes earning their pay, Coyle managed. Hale nodded once. Send them a Christmas card. Inside the harbor, the wind lost interest. Rain softened from assault to conversation. The towline sagged into a generous curve. The destroyer's engine slipped to a purr, her screws throwing only polite white. The Skerry stepped back like men who know they have made their point. Then came the last small cruelty. The mooring they aimed to make, an inner bollard with chain to the quay, sat a half-length further in than charted. The inner water shoaled by inches. The sounder stuttered. 26, 25. Halcyon draws more than that by habit and pride. Any more in and she would smudge her chart with her own name. "Sir," Coyle said carefully, "this is the part where we either write a legend or an investigation." "Neither," Hale said. "We write a receipt." He chose distance over glory. "Signal them to cast off on my mark. We'll carry them to the edge of comfort and no further. When I say they take their last weight themselves." "Aye." The destroyer kissed the edge of her draft and no more. Her bow nodded as if acknowledging the terms. "Mark," Hale said. The signal flashed. On Seestern, Brandt spun the wheel. The boatswain's voice aboard Halcyon climbed into that fine, high register men use to translate risk into muscle. The towline slackened into a big, wet snake. It splashed, it sighed. It lay down between ships like a story finished. Seestern coasted the last lengths under her own reluctant power. The pilot boat darted in like a friend who knows when to help and when to let dignity land itself. Lines flew. Cleats took strain. The trawler's hull tapped the quay with the gentlest, most expensive sound in the world. On Halcyon, no one cheered. Work isn't done by cheering. The boatswain's gang coiled the hawser with the tenderness of men who have handled a living thing. The engine room vented a breath of steam like a tired singer clearing his throat. Coyle closed the green binder and set a finger on the page he would cite if asked. The chaplain put a hand on the bridge rail and whispered thanks to wood and rope and math. On the quay, figures broke and ran. A pilot's apprentice, a nurse with a blanket, a woman with hands already opening in the shape of a cradle. Brandt stood frozen in the wheelhouse until some circuit in him reset. Then he took off his cap, pressed it to the glass, and bowed his head toward the destroyer like a man thanking a church. Hale lifted his cap in return, a small, secular benediction. "Engines back 1/4, he said softly. "Let's not wear out our welcome. Back 1/4, aye. Signal, safe in harbor. We depart." Halcyon slid away, stern first, a courteous retreat. The pilot boat's lantern bobbed farewell. The inner lamps blinked out one by one, modest to the end. Outside the Skerries, the swell waited with its old frown. The destroyer took it like an apology accepted. Behind them, in a town where blankets were warmer than politics, men put hands on wet rope and wept over the absence of nets that had fed them for years. Loss and salvation shared the same square of cobbles and did not argue. The harbor exhaled. Ahead, the convoy's ghost on the horizon asked nothing and offered less. Halcyon turned her bow toward duty and signed the night with 5 low notes from her horn. Not triumph. Not farewell, just proof of passage. On Seestern, Hannes finally let himself finish the prayer he had started at sea. He folded the photograph carefully and promised it more mornings. Mathis sat on the drum and let his bad hand throb. Ansel laughed that thin, charming laugh again, and this time it sounded like youth instead of defiance. Brandt looked at the empty stern where nets should have been. and then at the quay where men would lift their children with both hands. He decided the arithmetic was fair. Out beyond the harbor mouth, a white cone of light searched the weather until it found no more need for itself, and went dark. Harbors tidy what storms disarrange. By dawn, Bodo smelled of kelp, diesel, and relief. Seestern lay alongside with lines crossed smart and tight, her deck scoured clean by rain and necessity. The missing nets left a nakedness at her stern that made men look away out of courtesy. The way you avert your eyes when a friend has lost hair to illness. Loss has its own privacy, but it also has witnesses. The first sound on the quay was not cheering. It was the soft percussion of boots. Fishermen, pilots, a few soldiers, and 3 women in wool coats moved with that awkward efficiency of people who want to help and are afraid of helping wrong. A nurse from the clinic, Sina, hair pinned with 2 stubborn bobby pins, stepped aboard without asking. She checked fingers for frostbite, lips for dehydration, and steadied a boy too old to wobble and too young not to. Hot broth, she said briskly, then sleep. In her hands, orders became kindness. Skipper Brandt watched his men endure attention they had not asked for. When Ansel tried to lay claim to the moment with a grin that could have been arrogance if he'd slept, Brandt let it stand. The boy had earned one. Martha's hand wrapped in clean gauze kept flexing the bad fingers as if gratitude could be pumped into them like blood. Hannes leaned against the wheelhouse and looked toward the breakwater, where the sea still shouldered itself into the world with old habits. He reached for the photograph and did not need to look at it. It was the only image he saw no matter where his eyes rested. A harbor pilot climbed the trawler's ladder, paused, then offered Brandt a small brass token engraved with an anchor. "For nets," he said. "For luck." Brandt took it with a nod he couldn't find words for. Men like him had few places to put sentiment. They kept it in pockets with tokens. At the clinic, Sina and an elderly doctor whose spectacles had been mended twice with wire-tended rope burns and wind-burnt eyes. They asked careful questions about the tow and listened to answers that came in pieces. News reached the harbor before lunch. An American destroyer had towed a German trawler in from the mine belt, kept the gear until the last bend, and then, politely as a guest, departed. The phrasing mattered. People in occupied lands collect adverbs the way others collect coins. Manners are evidence. On Halcyon, evidence took the form of a logbook. In green ink that bled faintly where the page had drunk too much, Captain Hale wrote nothing operatic. Detached from convoy for humanitarian assist. 1 enemy trawler in tow. Navigated inshore lead concurrent with mine danger. Released tow at harbor approaches. Rejoined assigned station at 0610. Fuel expended, X. Wear on towline heavy but serviceable. He added a single sentence that did not appear in any instruction. Nets cut by trawler at critical turn with good judgment. Loss accepted to preserve life and hull. It was the sort of line a captain writes to remind himself that courage also looks like letting go. T. Coyle filed his signal copies with the neatness of a man who believes good bureaucracy can keep real ships afloat. He did not push to turn the event into a dispatchable anecdote. He knew how stories mutate once they leave steel and salt for paper and rumor. He contented himself with a private arithmetic. Convoy time lost, 40 minutes. Fuel acceptable. Crew readiness surprisingly high after. Risk absorbed, non-trivial. Lesson: mercy costs less than forecast when done with skill. The chaplain visited the forecastle and said very little. He handed a boatswain's mate a tin of salve for rope burns and accepted, without comment, a mug of coffee strong enough to etch the Navy crest off a cup. "That was a good night's work," the boatswain said. "Nobody will give us a ribbon for it." "I brought my own ribbon," the chaplain answered and held up his rosary with an awkward half-smile. The boatswain snorted, then tied a square knot in the air just to have something to do with his hands. By mid-morning, Halcyon slid back into her station astern of the convoy, like a contrite dog taking up heel. The corvette Redstart winked her masthead lamp. "Glad you survived your hobby." Halcyon replied, "You should try woodwork. Sailors have their own diplomacy." Back in Bordeaux, loss and salvation shared the same ledger line. A tug nosed Seestern deeper into the quay, and the men stood around the empty stern where nets should have been. Brandt took off his cap, turned it in his hands, and put it back on. "We fish again," he said to no one in particular. It sounded like a punishment and a promise. The town understood the vow's cost. A woman pressed a wrapped parcel into Ansel's hands, bread and a jar of herring. "For when your stomach remembers it's yours," she said. Near the lighthouse, a man who had once owned a little workshop hammered aluminum scrap into crude cork-lined floats. Children gathered and made suggestions that ignored physics and respected hope. By evening, somebody's cousin had traded a piglet for a roll of old mesh from a cannery. People who have known scarcity become fluent in barter. Time for rope, rope for fish, fish for more time. The day ended with the smell of something frying in pans that had seen uneasy years. On board Halcyon, the sea reasserted its arithmetic. Bearings, intervals, fuel curves. Coyle's pencil ticked margins again. Hale stood at the bridge wing, cap pulled low, and looked back toward the coast. The harbor lay behind the skerries like a story that had decided for once to end well. He did not congratulate himself. He touched the ship's bell once, the way a man signs a quiet agreement. That night, word hopped convoys and coasts with the efficiency of rumor and lantern code. A Norwegian radio operator wrote a line in a log he kept for no one but himself. "American destroyer spared us a funeral." In a Bodø kitchen, Sina unpinned her hair and fell asleep at a table. At the pilot station, the brass token stamped with an anchor clinked twice in Brandt's pocket when he hung his coat. And in the Halcyon's log, the green ink dried into ordinary words that would not impress a historian. That was all right. The sea remembers in rope fibers and habits, not footnotes. War ends the way storms do, first in the sky, then in the mind, finally in the hands that stop clenching. Weeks slid past. The rumor of Germany's collapse turned into the fact of surrender. Flags changed meanings. Minds did not. They kept sulking on chains until pilots and divers could argue them back into crates. In Bodø, the sea shrugged and went on being itself. Seestern learned to live thinner and smarter. The town rebuilt her stern like a surgeon who respects scars. New net drums, smaller, lighter. Fresh cork-lined floats stamped from aircraft scrap. A winch pall filed by a man who used to file propeller blades. The first time the rebuilt drums unspooled clean mesh, men pretended not to watch as if to spare the boat embarrassment. When the nets went out and the engine settled into its working grumble, Brandt stood with one hand on the wheel and one on the brass token the pilot had given him. Superstition is what you call respect when you're too proud to pray. They fished modestly at first, keeping close, measuring courage in cables and miles. Fish came slow, then faster. Bread tasted like a plan instead of a wish. Ansel discovered that jokes are easier when the deck is not trying to throw you into history. He told too many, and the others told him so with affection. Mathis learned a new way to work rope that spared his bad fingers and kept pride intact. Hannes wrote a letter on good paper and tucked the photograph inside a clean envelope. He mailed it to an address he had not spoken aloud during 4 winters of silence. Across the water, Halcyon's world changed shape. Convoys dwindled. Orders pointed south. There were rumors of refit, of mothballs, of another ocean with a different grammar of weather and war. The crew scrubbed rust, painted, ran drills because drills are what a ship does when tomorrow is undecided. Lieutenant Coyle sent his precise packet of reports and received a reply so correct it had to be kind. "Your detachment for humanitarian assist is noted. Escort schedule maintained with acceptable deviation. No adverse contact recorded. No medal, no rebuke." A small bureaucratic room where the night fit comfortably. The chaplain wrote a letter to a mother in Ohio, whose boy worked lines on the forecastle. He did not mention mines. He mentioned competence and decency, and the way a crew becomes a set of hands that know each other. He closed with a line that made him wince for being earnest and mailed it anyway. "If there is a record of mercies," your son added to it. Captain Hale received a private note, handwritten, unarchived, from the convoy commodore. "Next time warn me before becoming a tug." Hale smiled, wrote I, and kept the note inside the green binder like a pressed leaf. Spring crossed over into a gentler season. On a gray morning when the wind came from the west and smelt faintly of thaw, a launch from Bodø came alongside Halcyon while she laid for boiler work. The coxswain shouted up in English polished by storms, "Message for your captain." A bundle came aboard. A wooden box the size of a book wrapped in oilcloth sealed with string. Inside, coiled neatly, lay a short length of tarred hawser, spliced into a loop, and a brass plate stamped in Norwegian and English, "To the ship that towed us home." We lost our nets. We kept our lives. Crew of Seestern, Daniel Hale ran his thumb over the splice, the kind of work a boatswain would brag about, but he didn't call the boatswain. He went down to the forecastle himself and hung the looped hawser by the mess door. Men touched it on the way to coffee without being told why. Sailors understand relics when they see them. Months later, news flashed and faded. Japan, surrender, parades, demobilization papers. Halcyon steamed south and wore new paint that smelled wrong. Like a child in a borrowed coat, the ship grew quiet at odd hours. Men left in packets. The bell kept its tone. The deck learned new boots. Before the ship changed home ports, the looped hawser was unbolted and packed in a crate labeled Ship's Effects, retained aboard. The chaplain wrote the label. Coyle underlined it. Hale signed it. Bureaucracy can be a form of love. Years slipped like wake. In Bordeaux, a plaque appeared near the pilot station. No ceremony, just 4 screws and a piece of brass cut from a trawler's dead engine casing. It was shaped like a net weight. The words were small. April 1945. A towline between enemies. Harbor grateful. People touched it when they walked past on bad weather days. Some read it to their children. Some didn't, as if too much explanation would thin the thing itself. Seestern grew old, then respectable, then new again in pieces. Planks replaced, ribs steamed, romance hammered out and hammered back in. Brandt aged like boats do, creaks he could predict. A beauty that forgot how to be shy. On a spring morning long after the war, he took a boy to the end of the quay, Hannes's son it turned out, in a cap 1 size too big, and told him a story about a night when sandpaper and rope, prayer and math, enemies and neighbors all went into the same bundle and came out as morning. The boy listened the way boys listen when they are learning how to belong to a coast. In a museum case an ocean away, the looped hawser sat beside a modest placard. USS Halcyon, DD 628. Humane tow, Norwegian Sea, April 1945. People passed it on the way to bigger exhibits and loud stories. Some stopped, some didn't. It did not matter. The rope did not need witnesses. It had done its work once and would do it again without moving. It would bind memory to habit, habit to mercy, mercy to the next choice that asked for courage without applause. Every so often, a letter crossed the water and found its target with a competence that would have surprised the war. A note from Bordeaux to wherever Halcyon's men had scattered, or from a retired captain to a pilot's widow, or from a chaplain to Sina, who kept her hair with 2 pins into old age. The letters said little. They said enough. The sea kept its law. Harbors kept their lamps. People kept one small, impossible night as a private weather inside them, brought out when storms tested the timbers of who they were. History is loud about destruction. It rarely pauses for repair. Yet in the quiet corners of war, there are moments that argue back. Small, stubborn refusals to hate on schedule. The night between Halcyon and Seestern was one of them. No headlines were written, no medals struck. The sea does not decorate mercy. But among sailors, the story traveled as these things do. Half fact, half tone, all truth. They spoke of a captain who risked his ship for strangers, and of a fisherman who cut away his livelihood to keep that mercy alive. They spoke of a towline that joined not nations but instincts, competence, courage, care. When history tries to explain World War II, it measures bombs, fronts, treaties. It forgets that wars are also fought against what they turn men into. Every minefield crossed without firing, every life pulled from indifferent water, is a quiet victory over the very logic of war. Long after the destroyer was scrapped and the trawler rebuilt, that rope, the one that hummed between steel and wood in a Norwegian gale, remained a kind of scripture. It said, "We are built to destroy but also to mend. We are trained to obey but free to choose. We are strangers until weather makes us otherwise." The brass plaque in Bordeaux still catches light on gray days. People touch it without ceremony, not to remember a battle but to remember restraint, the hardest bravery of all. And somewhere under museum glass or in the heart of a fisherman's grandson, that looped hawser continues its quiet work. It binds the past to the present, the guilty to the good, and the sea to the kind of humanity that refuses to sink. Because in the war that tried to divide everything, one night in April proved that even enemies could share a single course and find Between storm and steel, the shape of peace. Subscribe for more true stories that remind us of what it means to be human, even in the darkest of times.